General Patton could see the end of the war, and it terrified him, not because of what was ending, but because of what was coming. The Soviets were swallowing Eastern Europe whole. He begged Eisenhower for permission to take Berlin, to push into Czechoslovakia, to stop Stalin before it was too late. The answer was always no. 40 years later, history proved Patton right. The guns had fallen silent across Europe. Germany lay in ruins, its armies shattered, its cities reduced to rubble. Allied soldiers were celebrating in the streets, drinking champagne, embracing strangers, weeping with relief that the nightmare was finally over. But, in a headquarters building in Bavaria, one American general sat alone at his desk, and he was not celebrating. General George S. Patton stared out the window at the mountains in the distance, his jaw tight, his eyes cold. He had just received orders to halt his advance. His Third Army, the most powerful fighting force in the European theater, was to stop where it stood. No push to Berlin, no liberation of Prague, no confrontation with the Soviet forces racing westward. Patton lit a cigar and watched the smoke curl toward the ceiling. He had spent 3 years fighting Germans. Now he was being told the real enemy was already behind him, wearing a different uniform, speaking a different language, and America was doing nothing to stop them. The problems had started weeks earlier, when the shape of post-war Europe was being decided not on battlefields, but in conference rooms. At Yalta, President Roosevelt had met with Churchill and Stalin to divide the continent into spheres of influence. Certain territories would fall under Soviet control. Certain cities would be liberated by certain armies. It was politics, pure and simple, and Patton despised politics. He understood war. He understood that when you had your enemy beaten, you pressed your advantage until they could never threaten you again. But this was different. The politicians were telling the generals where to stop, and the stopping points had nothing to do with military logic. They had everything to do with keeping Stalin happy. Patton read the agreements and felt his stomach turn. Eastern Europe was being handed to the Soviets on a silver platter. Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria. Millions of people who had suffered under Nazi occupation would now suffer under communist occupation. And American soldiers, who had the power to prevent it, were being ordered to stand down. Patton's Third Army had been unstoppable since breaking out of Normandy. They had raced across France, relieved Bastogne, crossed the Rhine, and driven deep into the heart of Germany. By early April, they were advancing so fast that their own supply lines could barely keep up. German resistance was collapsing. Entire divisions were surrendering without firing a shot. The road to Berlin was open. Patton's intelligence officers reported that Soviet forces were still fighting fierce battles on the Eastern Front. If Third Army moved quickly, they could reach Berlin before the Soviets did. Patton went to his maps and calculated the distances. His lead elements were closer to Berlin than the nearest Soviet units. He had the fuel. He had the ammunition. He had soldiers who would follow him anywhere. All he needed was permission. He picked up the phone and called Omar Bradley, his immediate superior. The conversation would be the first of many that left Patton frustrated and furious. Bradley listened to Patton's proposal and immediately shut it down. Berlin was not their objective. The decision had been made at levels far above either of them. Soviet forces would take Berlin. American forces would focus on southern Germany and the so-called National Redoubt, a rumored Nazi fortress in the Alps where Hitler might make a last stand. Patton argued that the National Redoubt was a myth, a fantasy invented by Nazi propagandists to distract the Allies. Intelligence had found no evidence of serious fortifications in the Alps, but Berlin was real. Berlin was the prize. Whoever took Berlin would have a psychological victory that would echo for decades. Bradley was sympathetic but firm. The orders came from Eisenhower, and Eisenhower was following instructions from Washington. This was not a military decision. It was a political one. Patton hung up the phone and sat in silence for a long moment. Then he called his chief of staff into the room. He wanted to know exactly how fast Third Army could reach Berlin if the order came. He refused to believe the politicians would actually let the Soviets have the German capital. The days passed, and the order never came. Instead, Patton received new objectives: advance into Czechoslovakia, liberate western regions, but under no circumstances cross certain lines on the map. Those lines represented the agreed-upon boundaries between American and Soviet zones of occupation. Patton studied the map and saw that Prague lay just beyond his permitted advance. The Czech capital was within easy reach. His tanks could be there in hours. The Czech resistance was begging for American liberation, sending desperate messages pleading for Patton to come before the Soviets arrived. Patton forwarded these messages to higher headquarters. He argued that liberating Prague would be a humanitarian act, saving the Czech people from Soviet domination. He pointed out that his forces were closer than any Soviet units. He could take Prague and present it as a fait accompli. What would Stalin do? Start a war with America over a city that was already liberated? The answer came back swiftly and firmly. No. Prague would be liberated by the Soviets. Patton would stop where he was. Patton began to speak openly about his frustrations, and his words grew increasingly dangerous. At dinner with his staff, he declared that America was fighting the wrong enemy. The Germans were beaten. They would never threaten anyone again. But the Soviets were expanding their empire with every passing day, and America was helping them do it. His officers listened nervously. Some agreed with him privately, but knew better than to say so publicly. Others worried that Patton was going too far, that his words would reach Washington and end his career. Patton did not care. He had never cared about his career more than he cared about winning. And right now, America was losing. Not to the Germans, but to the Soviets. Every mile of territory that Third Army could have taken but did not take was a mile that would fall under communist control. Every city they could have liberated but did not liberate would spend the next 4 decades behind the Iron Curtain. Patton saw this future clearly, and it enraged him. In early May, Patton received word that German forces in his sector wanted to surrender. But there was a complication. Many of these Germans were fleeing westward specifically to avoid capture by the Soviets. They had heard stories about what happened to German prisoners in Soviet hands. They wanted to surrender to Americans, to be treated as prisoners of war under the Geneva Convention, not shipped to labor camps in Siberia. Patton faced a dilemma. Officially, he was supposed to coordinate with Soviet forces on accepting surrenders. German units in the Soviet zone were supposed to surrender to Soviets, but thousands of German soldiers were streaming toward American lines, begging to be taken prisoner. Patton made a decision. He accepted every surrender that came to him. He processed German prisoners as quickly as possible, getting them into American custody before anyone could object. When Soviet liaison officers protested, Patton was dismissive. These men had surrendered to him. They were his prisoners. If the Soviets wanted prisoners, they could catch their own. The formal German surrender came on May 8th. The war in Europe was officially over. Celebrations erupted across the Allied world. But Patton's diary entry that night was grim. He wrote that America had won the war, but was losing the peace. He wrote that the Soviets were not allies, but enemies, and that America would realize this truth too late. He wrote that stopping at the Elbe River instead of pushing to Berlin was the greatest strategic mistake of the war. His words were bitter, angry, prophetic. He did not know that his diary would remain classified for years, that historians would eventually read his warnings and recognize how accurate they were. In that moment, he knew only that he had been prevented from finishing what he started, that millions of people would suffer because politicians feared offending Stalin, and that there was nothing he could do about it. He closed his diary and poured himself a drink. Outside, soldiers were singing and laughing. Patton felt only disgust. The weeks after victory brought new frustrations. Patton was appointed military governor of Bavaria. responsible for rebuilding the shattered region. He threw himself into the work with his usual energy, but he quickly ran into obstacles. The denazification program required removing all former Nazi party members from positions of authority. Patton found this impractical. Almost everyone with administrative experience had been a party member. If he removed all of them, there would be no one left to run the water systems, the electrical grids, the hospitals. He began making exceptions, keeping competent administrators in place regardless of their party history. His decisions were pragmatic but politically explosive. Critics accused him of being soft on Nazis. Patton responded that he was trying to prevent Bavaria from collapsing into chaos, that the alternative to using former party members was letting civilians starve. The controversy grew. Newspapers began questioning whether Patton was fit for peacetime command. Patton's troubles deepened when he held a press conference and spoke carelessly about denazification. When asked about the Nazi Party, he compared party membership to belonging to a political party in America, suggesting that many Germans had joined simply to advance their careers rather than out of ideological conviction. The comparison was tone-deaf, given the horrors the Nazi regime had committed. Headlines screamed that Patton was defending Nazis. Eisenhower was furious. He summoned Patton to a meeting and demanded an explanation. Patton tried to clarify his remarks, but only made things worse. He had never been good at politics, at saying the careful, measured things that politicians said. He spoke bluntly, honestly, and his honesty was destroying him. Eisenhower had protected Patton through scandal after scandal because Patton won battles. But the battles were over now. There were no more victories to justify Patton's behavior. Eisenhower made a difficult decision. He relieved Patton of command of Third Army. The relief was devastating. Third Army was Patton's creation, his masterpiece. He had built it into the most feared fighting force in Europe. Now it was being taken from him because he could not keep his mouth shut about politics. He was reassigned to command the 15th Army, a paper unit whose primary mission was writing the official history of the war. It was a meaningless post, a way to push Patton aside without formally punishing him. Patton accepted the assignment with outward grace but inward fury. He knew what was happening. He was being silenced. His warnings about the Soviets were inconvenient. His criticism of Allied policy was embarrassing. By removing him from real command, Eisenhower ensured that Patton's voice would carry less weight. Patton wrote to his wife that he felt like a man watching a disaster unfold in slow motion, powerless to prevent it. The Soviets were consolidating control over Eastern Europe. The Iron Curtain was descending, and America was pretending everything was fine. In his final months, Patton grew increasingly isolated. Old friends distanced themselves from him, worried that association with the controversial general would damage their own careers. Politicians who had once praised him now avoided his calls. The press, which had celebrated him as a hero, now portrayed him as a relic, a warmonger who could not adjust to peace. Patton retreated into his diaries, filling pages with his thoughts on the post-war world. He wrote about the coming conflict with the Soviet Union. He wrote about the mistakes America was making. He wrote about his own failures, the battles he had not been allowed to fight, the cities he had not been permitted to liberate. His writing was sometimes self-pitying, sometimes grandiose, but often remarkably prescient. He predicted that Eastern Europe would remain under Soviet domination for decades. He predicted that the Cold War would define international relations for the rest of the century. He predicted that America would eventually realize the Soviets were enemies, but only after it was too late to reverse their gains. Patton also reflected on his own nature and what it meant for his future. He was a warrior. He had trained his entire life for war. He had studied ancient battles, learned from Napoleon and Caesar and Alexander, dreamed of leading great armies into combat. And he had done it. He had led the most successful American army in European history. But now the war was over, and warriors were no longer needed. The world wanted diplomats, administrators, politicians. It wanted men who could smile and shake hands and pretend that Stalin was a trustworthy partner. Patton could not be that man. He could not pretend. He could not smile at Soviet officers and toast to friendship while knowing they were enslaving half of Europe. His honesty, which had made him a great combat commander, made him useless in peacetime. He told friends that he wished he had died in battle, that a soldier's death would have been preferable to this slow suffocation by politics and bureaucracy. The accident happened on December 9th. Patton was being driven through the German countryside when his car collided with a military truck. The crash was not severe, but Patton was thrown forward and struck his head on the partition separating the front and rear seats. He suffered a broken neck. The injuries left him paralyzed from the neck down. He was taken to a military hospital in Heidelberg, where doctors worked desperately to save him. For 12 days, Patton lingered. He was conscious at times, able to speak with visitors, but he knew the truth. His spine was severed. Even if he survived, he would never walk again, never ride a horse, never lead soldiers. For a man who had lived for action, who had defined himself through physical courage and aggressive leadership, the prospect of life as an invalid was unbearable. He told his wife that he was ready to die. He had no interest in living as a cripple. Patton died on December 21st. He was 60 years old. The official cause was pulmonary edema and congestive heart failure, complications from his injuries. His death shocked the nation. Just months earlier, he had been a conquering hero, leading American forces through the heart of Germany. Now he was gone, killed not in battle but in a traffic accident, a mundane end for a man who had lived so dramatically. Tributes poured in from around the world. Churchill called him one of the great captains of history. Eisenhower praised his courage and tactical brilliance, while carefully avoiding mention of their recent conflicts. Soldiers who had served under Patton wept openly. They remembered a general who had driven them relentlessly, but who had also shared their dangers, who had appeared at the front lines when no other general would, who had inspired them to achieve things they never thought possible. Whatever his flaws, Patton had earned their loyalty absolutely. Patton was buried in Luxembourg, in the American military cemetery at Ham. He had requested to be buried with his soldiers rather than return to America. The cemetery held thousands of Third Army men who had died in the fighting across Europe. Patton wanted to rest among them, their commander even in death. The funeral was modest by his standards. No great parade, no elaborate ceremony, just a soldier being laid to rest alongside other soldiers. His grave was marked with a simple white cross, identical to the crosses marking the graves of privates and sergeants. In death, the general who had worn flashy uniforms and pearl-handled revolvers was indistinguishable from the men he had led. It was perhaps the most fitting tribute possible. Patton had always insisted that generals should share the dangers of their soldiers. Now he would share their eternal resting place. The Cold War that Patton predicted arrived with stunning speed. Within 2 years of his death, the Soviet Union had consolidated control over Eastern Europe, installed communist governments in Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and Romania, and begun the blockade of West Berlin. Churchill gave his famous Iron Curtain speech, warning that a shadow had fallen across the continent. America launched the Marshall Plan to rebuild Western Europe and prevent further Soviet expansion. The Truman Doctrine committed the United States to containing communism wherever it threatened to spread. Everything Patton had warned about was coming true. The Soviets were not partners, but adversaries. Eastern Europe was not liberated, but enslaved. The decision to stop at the Elbe to let the Soviets take Berlin and Prague had consequences that would last for nearly half a century. Historians have debated Patton's warnings ever since. Some argue he was right, that America should have pushed harder while it had the military advantage, that taking Berlin and Prague would have strengthened the Western position in post-war negotiations. Others argue that confronting the Soviets in 1945 would have been catastrophic, that a war with Stalin would have cost millions more lives, that the atomic bomb was not yet ready to serve as a deterrent. Still others point out that Patton's proposed solutions were vague, that he talked about fighting the Soviets without explaining how such a war could be won, or what the endgame would look like. What remains undeniable is that Patton saw the Soviet threat more clearly than most of his contemporaries. While politicians spoke of cooperation and partnership, Patton recognized Stalin for what he was. His warnings were dismissed as warmongering. 40 years later, after the Berlin Wall fell and Eastern Europe finally gained its freedom, those warnings looked prophetic. Patton's legacy remains complicated. He was undoubtedly one of the greatest battlefield commanders in American history. His campaigns in North Africa, Sicily, France, and Germany demonstrated tactical brilliance and aggressive leadership that few could match. His ability to inspire soldiers, to push them beyond what they thought possible, was unparalleled. But he was also crude, insubordinate, politically naive, and sometimes cruel. The slapping incidents revealed a man who could not control his temper. His comments about denazification showed a tin ear for public relations. His obsession with the Soviets bordered on paranoia to those who did not share his assessment. He was impossible to manage, impossible to control, impossible to ignore. Eisenhower once said that Patton was the kind of general you wanted in war and dreaded in peace. It was an accurate assessment. Patton was built for combat, and when combat ended, he had no purpose left. Perhaps Patton understood this better than anyone. In his final diary entries, he wrote about feeling like an anachronism, a warrior in an age that no longer valued warriors. He had dreamed his whole life of leading great armies in decisive battles. He had achieved that dream, but the world moved on without him, toward diplomacy and negotiation and compromise. Patton could not compromise. He could not pretend that enemies were friends. He could not accept that sometimes the right decision was to stop fighting even when you were winning. His greatness was also his limitation. He saw the world in terms of victory and defeat, and the post-war settlement looked to him like defeat. He died believing that America had made a terrible mistake, that generations would suffer for the decisions made in 1945. He was not entirely wrong. Eastern Europe endured 4 decades of Soviet domination before finally gaining freedom. The Cold War cost trillions of dollars and claimed millions of lives. Whether Patton's approach would have prevented any of this remains unknowable. What is certain is that he tried to warn us, and we did not listen. Patton spent his final months warning everyone who would listen. He said America had stopped the wrong army. He said the Soviets were the real threat. He said we would regret letting them take Eastern Europe. For 40 years, people called him a warmonger. Then the Berlin Wall fell, and we finally understood what he meant. Was Patton right? Should we have pushed to Berlin when we had the chance? Or would that have started World War III? Tell me what you think in the comments. And if this story made you think differently about the end of the war, hit that subscribe button. History is full of warnings we ignored. This was one of them.